My name is Lavinia Marchand Truitt, and on the afternoon of the 26th of October, in the year 1889, 2 weeks before Montana was admitted to the Union as the 41st state, I was set down by a daily and coulee overland coach at a four-corner crossroads 8 miles east of Helena, with a single trunk, a folded letter, $11.42 in a small leather traveling purse, and the early snow already falling in soft, slow flakes that caught on the dry prairie grass without melting. The driver, an Irishman named Donald, who had not spoken to me in 390 miles of road from Casper, set the trunk down beside the signpost. He did not look at me. He climbed back up to the box. He said only, in the soft voice of a man who had carried a number of women out to that crossroads in his 11 years on the line, "Ma'am, the team's been told. The Bozeman Spur is that way. The Diamond City Road is the other. I am not allowed to tell you any more than that." He clucked the team. The coach pulled away east toward Bozeman. I stood beside my trunk in the falling snow with the folded letter in my hand and watched the dust of the team mix into the snow until the snow won. I was 19 years old that afternoon. I had been 1,200 miles from home for 9 days. I was 5 months pregnant by a man named Hosea Malden of Helena, Montana Territory, who had promised in writing in February to marry me, and who had, 3 hours earlier, on the Helena Depot platform in front of 7 witnesses, including the station master and his wife, refused. I was the only daughter of the Reverend Ezekiel Marchand Truitt of the First Methodist Episcopal Church of St. Joseph, Missouri, and my father had, on the evening of the 7th of October, after my mother had told him at supper of my condition, stood up from the supper table in the parsonage on Felix Street, walked into his study, written a single Western Union money order in the amount of $40, written a single one-line letter dated that night reading, "You will go where you have arranged to go, and you will not return," and laid both on the dining room table beside my soup bowl, and had not, between that evening and the morning of my departure on the 11th, spoken to me again. My mother had given me, on the platform of the St. Joseph Depot at 3 in the morning of the 11th, the silver oval locket she had worn at her own wedding in 1868, and a folded handkerchief with a small brown stain at one corner, that I understood without being told was from the supper of the 7th, and one whispered sentence at the open coach door before she stepped back. The sentence was, "I love you. I am sorry. I will write to General Delivery, Helena." The conductor closed the door. The coach left. I want to set down the truth about Hosea Malden because the rest of the story will not make sense without it. He was 35 years old. He was a Helena cattleman with a quarter section north of the city, 3,000 head running on open range under the Malden Crossroads brand his father had registered in 1871. A tailored dark gray 4-button frock coat from a tailor in St. Louis, hand-tooled tan leather knee boots polished to a mirror, and a fiancée named Cordelia Vermeulen Hartshorn, whose father was the senior partner at the Hartshorn Vermeulen Mercantile, and whose marriage to Hosea Malden had been quietly settled in late June at a private supper at the Hartshorn Vermeulen House in Helena, 11 weeks after he had written the last of his 14 letters to me. He had met me in February at a revival meeting in St. Joseph, at which my father had preached the morning sermon. He had stayed afterward in the church basement for the cold meat and coffee meal. He had walked me home along Felix Street. He had returned in March, in May, in July, in September. He had written me letters between the visits. He had, in September, in the small writing room of the parsonage, on a Saturday afternoon, when my father was away at the Methodist District Conference at Hannibal, done the thing that produced the small, soft swell at my waist that my mother had recognized at supper on the 7th of October. He had written me twice in the 3 weeks after the September visit, on the Malden Crossroads stationery, in the same easy, elegant hand as the previous letters, with the same easy, elegant assurances. He had not, however, mentioned Cordelia Vermeulen Hartshorn. He had not mentioned either the supper at the Hartshorn Vermeulen house. The 11th letter, which arrived at the parsonage 3 days after my mother had spoken to my father at supper, had been a single sheet of cream stationery and 3 sentences. I have arranged a place for you at the Lutheran Widows' Home at Helena. I will pay your room and board for the term. The matter we have spoken of cannot be made public. There was no signature beyond the embossed Malden Crossroads brand at the upper right of the page. The folded letter in my hand at the Crossroads was that letter. I had taken the coach with the $40 and the locket and the supper-stained handkerchief. I had ridden 390 miles to Casper on the 7-day St. Joseph Casper run, 470 from Casper to Bozeman on the 6-day Casper Bozeman run, and 340 from Bozeman to Helena on the 4-day Bozeman Helena run, in 3 successive coaches, each smelling of unwashed wool and lamp oil and kerosene heaters and tobacco, with 3 changes of team a day and a single brief stop each evening at a roadhouse for a meal of bacon, beans, and weak coffee. The first coach had carried, besides me, a Methodist lay preacher of Wisconsin extraction named Mr. Thaddeus Yates Hartshorn, who had read the Book of Ruth aloud to the 4 passengers across the 2nd day on the Mr. Thaddeus Yates Hartshorn's own initiative, and a young widow of perhaps 30, traveling west to a brother in the Black Hills with a small daughter of 3, and a sleeping arrangement at every roadhouse in which the small daughter slept across her mother's lap on the wagon bench. I had taken, on the 3rd day, the small daughter into my own arms for an hour while the mother slept against my shoulder, and the small, soft, warm weight of the small daughter against the small, soft swell at my own waist had been, in that hour, on the wagon bench between Lincoln and North Platte, the first hour in 12 days during which I had not been afraid. The second coach, between Casper and Bozeman, had carried a single Norwegian-American freighter named Mr. Newt Pendergrass, who had not said 3 sentences in 6 days, and who had, on the morning of the 4th day at a roadhouse outside Sheridan, paid for my breakfast at the counter, without my knowing he had, until the proprietor told me at the door, and had not afterward met my eye when I had tried, in the carriage, to thank him. The third coach, between Bozeman and Helena, had carried a young schoolteacher named Miss Avalon Speakeasy of Ohio extraction, traveling west to a position at a small Grange schoolhouse outside Lewistown, who had, on the 2nd day of that run, when the road climbed into the Bozeman Pass and the snow on the upper switchbacks had begun to come down, given me her own woolen rebozo from her own traveling trunk to wrap over my shoulders, and had refused, when I had tried to return it at Helena, to take it back. The rebozo I am still using, dear listener, to this morning, on the porch of the cabin at the bend of Owl Creek above Diamond City. It is the rebozo I am writing this account in, this evening, with Esther's daughters playing at my feet on the punch-and-plank floor. I had not slept in a bed in 9 days. I had not bathed in 11. I had counted, twice a day, the small, soft movements at my waist that were now strong enough to feel under the wool of the traveling dress. I had arrived in Helena on the morning of the 26th at 1:15. Hosea Malden had been on the platform with one of his hired men. He had not, on first sight, recognized me. When the second look had landed and the 11 days of road had not entirely concealed me, his face had gone a color I had not seen on a man's face before. He had told me, in the small, careful voice he had not used in any of the 14 letters, that the arrangement at the widow's home in Helena had been untenable on review. He had told me that the only arrangement he could now offer was passage on the next eastbound coach, with an additional $30 added to the $40 I already had, and a single recommendation that I find a small Catholic mission in Diamond City, 22 miles to the east, where a French priest was known to take in young women in my circumstance for the term of their confinement and arrange afterward for the placement of the child with a willing family in the Big Belt Valley. He had handed me the $30 in 3 $10 bills folded into a small white linen envelope. He had stepped back. The hired man had carried my trunk to the eastbound coach. The eastbound coach had half a mile out of Helena stopped at the four-corner Crossroads, and Donald the driver had set my trunk down beside the signpost. He had not, in his 11 years on the line, set down a young woman at that crossroads in worse weather. He had not, in his 11 years, set down a young woman at that crossroads who had a smaller chance of making the 22 miles to Diamond City before the snow stopped her. I sat down on the trunk. I unfolded the linen envelope. I counted the 3 $10 bills. I counted the $11.42 from the original traveling purse. I had $41.42 on me at a crossroads 8 miles east of Helena, and 22 from Diamond City with the early snow falling and the light gone in 40 minutes and a 5-month pregnant body that had not slept in 9 days. I want to tell you plainly that I considered sitting on the trunk in the falling snow with the folded letter in my hand the option that any 19-year-old preacher's daughter sitting in the same place might have considered. I considered it for the length of time it took me to count the bills. Then I considered the small, soft movement at my waist that the wool of the traveling dress had pressed against my hand as I sat down. I did not consider it after that. I stood up. I picked up the trunk handle. I began to walk east on the Diamond City Road. I had walked perhaps 40 paces when the snow shifted from soft, slow flakes to a thick, wet-blowing sleet, and I stopped because I am not, as it turned out, a foolish woman. I sat down on the trunk again. I considered, for the second time, whether I should walk back to Helena. Helena was 8 miles. Diamond City was 22. The sleet, by the sound of it, was the front edge of a storm that would close the prairie inside the hour. I had no rain cloak under the wool. I had no shelter on the road in either direction. I had not eaten since 6 o'clock that morning at a roadhouse in White Sulphur Springs. I sat on the trunk and put my hands together over the small, soft swell at my waist and bowed my head, and for the first time since the supper of the 7th of October, I prayed. The prayer did not last long, because I had not, in my 19 years, been the kind of preacher's daughter who prayed long. I had been the kind who read the books of Job and Ruth straight through twice a year and underlined the passages I did not understand and did not pretend to understand them. I prayed in plain English, the way Ruth speaks to Boaz. I asked plainly whether there was a Boaz in the country east of Helena who would not look at me the way Hosea Malden had looked at me on the depot platform. I said, "Amen." I opened my eyes. I heard the horse before I saw the horse. The horse was coming down the Diamond City Road from the east at a slow, careful walk. and the sound of the hooves on the wet gravel was the sound of a horse that had been on the road that direction for 10 miles and was not in any hurry to be on it for 10 more. The horse was a sound bay gelding with a wide white blaze. The rider was a man of perhaps 33, lean, upright, wiry, in a long fringed elk-hide hunting coat with the fringes wet at the bottom, and a faded soft black flat-crowned wool felt hat pulled low against the sleet, with a single wild turkey feather in the band, and a marlin lever-action carbine across the pommel under his right hand. He had a beaded Métis sash with red and blue floral motif tied at his belt beside the sheath of a Sheffield butcher knife. The shoulder-length dark brown hair under the hat was tied back at the nape with a strip of dark blue trade cloth, and the small old white scar across his left cheekbone caught the failing light when he came level with the signpost. He drew the bay up 6 paces from the trunk. He sat the saddle in 3/4 profile and looked at me without surprise, and without curiosity, and without any of the looks I had been receiving from men since the morning of the 11th on the platform at St. Joseph. He looked at me the way a man on a long road looks at a thing on the road that has not been there before and that he is going to have to consider before he goes any further. He said, in a voice that was lower and slower than the voices I was used to, with a soft Métis French cadence underneath, "Ma'am, are you all right?" I said, in the small, steady voice I had not yet decided whether I had. "No, sir, I am not." He nodded once. He swung down from the bay in a single careful motion. He left the carbine across the pommel. He walked the 4 paces between us. He did not stop 2 paces away, the way a town man would have stopped. He came right up beside the trunk. He took off his hat. The hair tied at the nape fell forward, and he pushed it back with his right hand. He said, "You sat on the trunk a minute ago. You did some thinking. You quit thinking and walked a piece. You sat down again. You've been sitting since." He paused. The sleet was falling on his shoulders. He said, "Ma'am, I'd be obliged to know your name." I told him my name. I told him only my name. I told him no more. He said, "My name is Cassander Beaudry. I run a small string of cattle out of a cabin 12 miles east of here, on the south slope of the Big Belt above where Diamond City used to be. I'd like to ask you a question, ma'am, and I'd like you to answer it honest, because the answer's going to decide what I do next, and I don't want to do anything either of us is going to regret. Are you waiting for somebody on this road who is coming? Or are you sitting on this trunk because the man you came west to find told you not to sit on his bench?" I did not answer at once. I considered what kind of answer the question deserved. I considered who the man asking it was. I considered the carbine across the pommel and the long fringed elk-hide coat with the fringes wet at the bottom and the small old white scar on the left cheekbone. And I considered the fact that he had asked the question with his hat in his right hand and not with his hand on the carbine. I said, in the same small, steady voice, "I am not waiting for anybody, sir. I came west to find a man who has refused me. I have been set down here by his arrangement. I am to make my way to a Catholic mission in Diamond City. I do not, sir, have any way to make my way to Diamond City this evening. I will make a fire if you can spare me a match. I will find a way at first light." He looked at the trunk. He looked at the sleet. He looked at the wool of my traveling dress where the soft swell at my waist showed under it. He did not, when his eye crossed the swell, change expression. He looked back at my face. He said, "Ma'am, I am going to put your trunk on the back of my pack horse, which is hitched a 1/4 mile up the road behind a screen of cottonwood where I left him out of the wind. I am going to put you up on Caleb here. I am going to walk Caleb the 12 miles back to my cabin. We are going to be there in 3 hours, in time for me to set you in front of a fire and put a kettle on and feed the bay. I am going to sleep tonight in the pole barn with the horses. The cabin is going to be yours for the night and for the morning. In the morning, after we have had coffee at my table, you and I are going to talk about what you do next. The cabin's big enough for 3. The pole barn is big enough for 1. The Catholic priest at St. Mary's Mission at Diamond City, who I have known since I was 18, is a man named Father Joubert, and he is in the country he is in for reasons very much like the ones you are. He is going to be there next Sunday, whether we ride down to him or not. He is going to be there the Sunday after that. He is going to be there until you tell me, ma'am, with the small, steady voice you've got, what it is you would like to do. He paused. He looked once at my face. He said, with the small change in the voice that I would later understand was the only place his face ever showed feeling, I have not asked you, ma'am, to trust me. I am asking you to come in out of the sleet. There is a difference. I want to set down what came next plainly, because I have heard, in the 3 decades since, a number of versions of it from people who were not at the Crossroads, and the versions are all wrong in the same direction. I did not weep. I did not collapse. I did not throw myself on the kindness of the stranger. I sat on the trunk and looked up at Cassander Beaudry for what could not have been more than 4 seconds, and I asked him, in the same small, steady voice, 2 questions. The first question was, "Sir, have you a wife?" The second question was, "Sir, have you ever raised a hand to a woman?" He answered both questions plainly and immediately, without any of the small embellishments a town man adds to the answer of either. He said, "No, ma'am, I have not had a wife. I am 33 years old. I have been on the trap line and the cattle since I was 12. The country I live in has not had room for it." He said, "No, ma'am, I have never raised a hand to a woman. My mother, who is buried at St. Mary's at Diamond City, would not have permitted it. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a Métis voyageur from Red River who married an Assiniboine woman in 1842 and lived with her 31 years, and the men in his line, ma'am, do not raise hands to women." I stood up from the trunk. I picked up the small leather traveling purse. I held out my left hand. He took it. The hand was warm through the wool fingerless glove. He boosted me up into the saddle of the bay-gelding Caleb in a single careful motion, with the right hand under my left elbow and the left hand at the small of my back. He picked up the trunk. He carried it the 1/4 mile up the road to the cottonwood screen. He hitched the trunk behind the saddle of the roan pack horse. He walked the bay back down to me. He took the bay's bridle. He started us east on the Diamond City Road. The sleet thickened. The light went in 20 minutes. He had a small, cracked tin lantern hooked to the pack horse's panniers, and he stopped once in the 3rd hour and lit it, and the lantern threw a soft yellow circle on the wet, dark prairie ahead of us. He did not, in 3 hours, look up at me except to ask me, twice, whether I was warm. The first time I said, "Yes, sir." The second time I said, "Yes, Cassander." He nodded the second time. He did not nod the first. If you have stayed with us this far, I would only ask, before I tell you what came after the cabin, that you take a moment to subscribe to Ridge and Vow, because the rest of what I am going to tell you is the slow, patient turning of one stranger's 2 questions and one man's 2 answers into a thing my husband and I lived inside for 38 years, And the people who stay are the people who came in carrying their own version of the small, steady voice on the trunk in the sleet. The cabin came up out of the dark at 23 minutes past 9. Cassander led the bay up the last quarter mile of switchback trail with the lantern in his right hand. The cabin was a single-room, hand-hewn ponderosa log structure, 16 feet by 20, with a sod and shake roof, a single window of 2 old wavy panes and 3 oiled deer hide squares, a stone and mortar chimney rising 20 feet from the south wall, a heavy plank door of 3 vertical fir planks, and the smell of cured pine and wood smoke before he had even unlocked the door. He set the lantern on a stump beside the porch step. He helped me down from the bay. He said, in the same low, slow voice, "Ma'am, you go in, the door's not locked. There's a fire banked at the stove. There's water in the kettle. There's coffee in the tin and bread in the box. I'll be 10 minutes with the horses. Take the bed. The bed's clean." He nodded toward a curtained nook against the north wall. He went out to the pole barn. I went in. I closed the door behind me. I stood with my back against the door and did not move for the count of 100. The cabin was warm. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke and a faint trace of saddle soap. The cabin was tidy in the way a single man's cabin is tidy when he has decided, on the first day of his 33rd year, that the cabin will be tidy whether or not anyone else is going to see it. The floor was punch and plank, swept. The walls had 4 pegs above the door for hat and coat and belt and rifle, and the rifle peg was empty because the rifle had come back with Cassander. The hearth was clean of ash. The kettle on the iron arm was full. There was a small iron skillet hanging on a nail above the stove. There was a deep open shelf along the east wall holding tin plates and tin cups and a small stack of 3 books, a King James Bible, a worn Missouri printed school reader from 1878, and a single volume of the works of Walter Scott. There was a small work table with a single chair under the window. There was the curtained nook against the north wall with a rope and frame bed and a clean wool blanket folded at the foot. There was a single small pewter-framed daguerreotype on the shelf above the bed of a black-haired woman of perhaps 30 in a beaded Métis dress with a small carved wooden cross on a leather thong at her throat. He came in 10 minutes later. He did not, when he came in, cross the room. He stopped in the small space between the door and the stove. He set the lantern on the work table. He did not take off the elk hide coat. He said, "Ma'am, the kettle's hot. The coffee's in the blue tin on the 3rd shelf. The bread is in the wooden box on the 2nd. The cheese is in the larder under the bed. There is a chamber pot in the 2nd cupboard for the night. The pole barn is 40 paces east. I will be there. If you need anything between now and first light, you ring the iron triangle on the porch post, and I will come. There is a bar on the inside of the door. Drop it. You will sleep better with it dropped." He took a single oil lamp off the shelf and lit it from the lantern. He set it on the work table. He picked up the lantern. He went out. He shut the door behind him from the outside. I heard his boots cross the porch. I heard him cross the dooryard to the pole barn. I heard the pole barn door open and close. I heard, in the long quiet that followed, the soft shifting of 3 head of stock moving in their stalls. I dropped the bar. I sat down at the work table. I unlaced my traveling boots. I drank the kettle's water in 3 slow cups with a pinch of the coffee. I cut a slice of the bread from the wooden box and a thin slice of the cheese from the larder under the bed. I ate them sitting at the work table. I lay down on the bed in my traveling dress, with the wool blanket pulled up to the chin, and I slept. I slept for 9 hours and 40 minutes. I had not, since the supper of the 7th of October, slept that long in a single stretch. When I woke, it was 20 minutes before 7 on the morning of the 27th of October, and the small, soft movement at my waist had been moving for some time, and the pale gray morning light was coming in through the 2 wavy panes of the east window, and the iron triangle on the porch post had not been rung in the night. We sat at the work table at 7:30 on the morning of the 27th, with a tin pot of strong coffee between us, and the small iron skillet of bacon and 3 eggs from the Plymouth Rocks on a tin plate between us. And we had the conversation we had agreed at the Crossroads we would have. He poured the coffee. He laid out the eggs. He sat across from me and put his hands flat on the table. He said, "Ma'am, I want to lay out 3 things. The first is what I think you should do if you would prefer to go back to St. Joseph. The second is what I think you should do if you would prefer to go on to St. Mary's Mission at Diamond City. The third is what I would like to offer you, Lavinia, if neither of those is what you want to do." He laid them out. The first was, he would drive me himself in his small wagon to Helena that morning, pay my passage on the next eastbound stage from his own purse, and write me a letter of introduction to a woman he knew at the Methodist Mission in St. Joseph, who would not, he said, ask any questions she did not need the answer to. He would do this without conditions, and without expecting anything in return. The second was, he would saddle Caleb and the roan and ride me down to St. Mary's Mission at Diamond City that afternoon, hand me over to Father Joubert, leave a small pouch of his own coin with the mission for my room, and board through the term of my confinement and return to the cabin. He would visit the mission once a month if I wanted, and not at all if I did not. He would do this also without conditions. The third he laid out more slowly. He said, "Lavinia, I am 33 years old. I have a quarter section under the patent law I filed in '86 and proved up in '88. I have a clear deed on this cabin and the 80 acres immediately around it. I have 140 head of cattle running on open range under my own brand. I have a savings account at the First National Bank in Helena of $742 and a small private cache of placer dust in a tobacco tin under the stove that I will tell you the location of if you decide what I'm about to ask you. I have, against me, the fact that I am half a Métis French-Canadian voyageur and half an American homesteader, and that my mother is buried at St. Mary's at Diamond City under a French Catholic name that my father did not put on the headstone, and that Father Joubert and I cut into the headstone ourselves the spring after she died. I have also, against me, the fact that I am 33 and have not married, and I have, lastly, the simple fact that you do not know me." He paused. He looked at his hands flat on the table. He said, with the small change in the voice I had heard once at the Crossroads, "Lavinia, the cabin's big enough for 3. I will marry you at St. Mary's Mission on the next Sunday. Father Joubert is hearing confessions, which is the 3rd of November. I will not, at the marriage, ask anything of you that you have not already given. I will give the child your father's last name, or the name you choose, or my own, depending on what you want. I will not, at any time afterward, raise the question of the man in Helena. I will not ever raise a hand to you or to the child. I will give you, by deed at the marriage, an undivided half-interest in the cabin, the 80 acres, and the brand, and I will lodge the deed at the Lewis and Clark County Recorder's Office in Helena on the Monday following the marriage. If at any time, Lavinia, you decide that the country east of Helena is not the country you can live in, I will pay your passage to wherever you decide to go, and I will not contest the deed or the undivided half-interest, and I will continue to send you, through the recorder's office, your share of the cattle income for the rest of my life. Those are my terms. They are not negotiable downward. They are negotiable only upward. I would like an answer, Lavinia, when you have an answer. I am going to drink my coffee. There is no hurry. I drank my coffee. He drank his. The small, soft movement at my waist moved twice while I drank. The iron skillet cooled at the center of the table. The pale gray morning light moved an inch on the puncheon floor. I considered the 3 offers in the order he had laid them out. I considered the man across the table in his long, fringed elk-hide hunting coat, and his shoulder-length dark brown hair tied back with the strip of dark blue trade cloth, and his careful, weathered hands flat on the work table. I considered the small, pewter-framed daguerreotype on the shelf above the bed, and what kind of son had cut a French Catholic name into the headstone of his own mother. I considered the cabin. I considered the iron triangle on the porch post that had not been rung in the night. I considered what my father, the Reverend Ezekiel Marchand Truitt, would have said about each of the 3 offers. I considered what my mother, who had given me the silver oval locket and the supper-stained handkerchief, would have said. I considered the 3rd question I had not asked at the Crossroads, which was the question I now asked in the same small, steady voice across the work table. I said, "Cassander." Why? He looked at me a long, careful moment across the coffee. He said, "Lavinia, I have been on this country since I was 12. I have known the kind of country it is. I have seen on a number of roads women who have been set down at crossroads in worse weather than the weather yesterday, and I have ridden past more of them than I am proud of, because in '83 I was 27, and I did not yet know what I am going to tell you. What I am going to tell you is this. The country east of Helena is a country in which a man has, in a year, perhaps 3 afternoons of weather like yesterday's afternoon, in which a thing comes onto the road that a man on horseback can do or not do, and the doing of it or the not doing of it determines, at a depth most men do not afterward want to look at, whether the man is the man he was raised to be or whether the man is something less than that. I have not been the man I was raised to be on every one of the 3 afternoons in every one of the years I have been here. I have been the man I was raised to be on enough of them that I have, by the morning of my 33rd year, decided that the next afternoon of that kind is going to be the kind I do not, afterward, have to look at out of the corner of my eye. Yesterday afternoon was the next afternoon. You were the thing on the road. The doing of it was carrying you 12 miles in the sleet to a warm cabin and offering you this morning a work table and 3 coffees and 3 offers. The 3rd offer is the one I would prefer, but it is not the offer I am pressing on you. The first 2 are the offers I would lay down for any woman I had carried 12 miles in the sleet, ma'am. The 3rd offer is the one in which I am asking you for something. He paused. He looked at his hands. He said, very quietly, "Lavinia, I would like to be asked, in this house, to share it. I have not been asked in 33 years. I would like, if you find it in you, to be asked." I sat with the small pewter-framed daguerreotype in the corner of my eye, and the iron triangle on the porch post in my mind, and the small, soft movement at my waist in the steady rhythm it had taken on through the long stretch of sleep. I said, in the small, steady voice that was the only voice I had been speaking in since the Crossroads, "Cassander Beaudry. The third offer. Yes. The 7 days between the morning of the work table and the morning of the wedding. I want to set down briefly, dear listener, because the 7 days are the days a number of well-meaning women in Diamond City and Helena have, in the years since, claimed I cannot have made the decision in. I will say only that the decision was not made in 7 days. The decision was made on the trunk in the sleet on the afternoon of the 26th, between the moment Cassander Beaudry laid his hand open on Halvar. The bay gelding's name was the same, Mijos, in your version of this story. Between the moment he laid his hand open at the bay's neck and the moment he asked me whether I was waiting for someone, the 7 days that followed were the days a sensible woman of any age uses to look at the cabin in daylight, walk the pole barn in daylight, watch a man feed his stock on the morning of the 28th, and again on the morning of the 30th. Watch the same man load a wagon for Diamond City on the morning of the 29th, and unload the same wagon on the afternoon of the 31st. Watch the same man split cottonwood on the woodpile on the morning of the 1st of November, sit on the work table across from him 3 times a day at 3 meals he prepared with his own hands across the 7 days, and decide at the end of the 7 days that the man at the work table in the cabin on the south slope of the upper Big Belt above Diamond City was the man the trunk in the sleet had decided he was on the afternoon of the 26th. He drove me down to Diamond City in his small wagon on the morning of the 2nd of November to see Father Joubert and to see also the small log boarding house of a Mrs. Cordelia Hartshorn Marchand, at which he had paid, that morning, the room and board for me for a single night, so that I might sleep on the night before the wedding under a roof that was not yet the cabin's. He drove me up the 4 miles to the cabin on the afternoon of the 2nd to fetch a small wedding dress Mrs. Hartshorn Marchand and Avalon Pomeroy had altered together in the previous 5 days from a deep cream wool gown Mrs. Hartshorn Marchand had worn at her own wedding in 1873 and had kept in a cedar trunk against, by her own account that afternoon, a moment of small private generosity she had been waiting 28 years to express. The wool dress was let out at the waist. The small cream cotton lace cuffs were taken from the original sleeves and reset after the let-out. The small white wildflower I wore at the temple of the Chignon at the wedding was a dried winter rose Avalon Pomeroy had cut from her own front porch arbor the previous summer and pressed in a hymnal. Cassander himself prepared, on the night of the 2nd, in the small cabin he had not yet taken me into in the evening. One further thing I have not before this hour set down in writing. He took, from the small cedar trunk at the foot of the bed in the curtained nook, a single small folded handkerchief his own mother Ursule had embroidered for him on the day of his first communion in 1866, with a small fly-stitched border in dark blue silk thread along the 4 edges, and a single small heraldic métis fleur-de-lis at one corner in red silk thread. He laid the handkerchief on the work table beside the small velvet bag containing the wedding ring he had ordered through Father Joubert from a Helena jeweler in the 2nd week of October, on the careful, slow assumption that a wedding ring would be wanted by him at some hour in the next 12 months, whether or not he yet knew on whose finger. He had not, on the morning of the work table on the 27th, mentioned the velvet bag. He had not, in the 7 days, mentioned the handkerchief. He laid them, both, on the work table on the night of the 2nd. He laid them at the place Mrs. Hartshorn Marchand and I would sit at breakfast the next morning. They were, when I came up the porch step at 7:30 on the morning of the 3rd, on the work table. We were married at St. Mary's Mission at Diamond City on the morning of Sunday the 3rd of November, 1889, by Father Antoine Joubert, who was a Métis French Catholic priest of 58 who had baptized Cassander himself in 1856 in a tin baptismal font that had been carried up Confederate Gulch on the back of a mule by Father Joubert's predecessor in 1863, and that was still, in 1889, the only baptismal font St. Mary's Mission had, and who had, in the years between Cassander's baptism and our wedding, baptized 142 children of the upper Big Belt at the same font, married 38 couples in the same chapel, and buried, in 1873, in the small graveyard of 41 stones behind the mission under a French Catholic name. Cassander's mother, Ursule Métis Baudry, who had been 32 years old at her death, and who had been the first woman in the parish to teach Father Joubert the proper Cree pronunciation of the Pater Noster. The chapel of St. Mary's was, in November of 1889, a single-room hand-hewn ponderosa log structure, 28 feet by 16, sod and shake roof, a small east-facing window of 2 wavy panes of glass and 1 oiled deer-hide square, an altar of split cedar planks set on 2 ponderosa stumps, a tarnished pewter crucifix Father Joubert had carried west from Quebec in 1861, 2 beeswax candles lit by Cassander himself at 6 that morning in the small private offering he had made on his mother's behalf since he was 17 years old, and a single oval rag rug of mixed Métis and Shoshone weaving on the puncheon-plank floor in front of the altar, made for the chapel by Cassander's grandmother in 1878. The Mass was in Latin. The homily was in 3 languages: French, which Father Joubert preferred for matters of grace; English, which Father Joubert preferred for matters of practical instruction; and a few quiet sentences of Cree, which Father Joubert reserved for the only person in the chapel who would understand them, to a small old woman in the second pew on the right, whose name I would later learn was Peasim Pendergrass Baudry, Cassander's grandmother on his mother's side, who was at that hour 79 years old, and who had walked the 4 miles down from her own small log cabin in the upper Big Belt that morning, in a beaded Métis shawl of red trade cloth and dark blue stroud, a pair of quill-worked moccasins she had stitched herself in 1883, and a small folded eagle feather pinned at the temple by a strip of red trade cloth. She had walked the 4 miles in the slow, careful way a 79-year-old Métis Cree grandmother walks, with a single carved willow walking staff her late husband had cut for her in 1868. She had carried, in a small leather pouch beaded in the same red and blue floral motif as Cassander's sash, a small dry braided sweetgrass for the offering, and a small carved wooden crucifix of birch from the Red River country that her own grandmother had carved in 1812. She had laid the sweetgrass and the crucifix at the altar before the Mass began. She had taken her seat. She had not in the Mass taken her eyes off Cassander. After the Mass, dear listener, when Father Joubert had blessed us and the small congregation of 17 people, Erastus Pomeroy and his wife Avalon, Doss Pendergrass and his wife Hortense, 4 trappers Cassander had known since he was 18, 3 Diamond City widows Father Joubert had served for 30 years, 2 Shoshone families from the lower wintering camp at the Warm Springs, and a single quiet Welsh-born blacksmith named Mr. Owain Hartshorn Marchand, who had brought the iron strap hinges for the chapel door in 1884 and had not missed a Sunday service since, had stood and applauded in the soft, quiet way that frontier congregations applaud. Pisim came forward. She walked the 8 paces from the second pew to where I stood at the altar with Cassander on my left and Father Joubert beside me. She did not, before she spoke, look at Cassander. She looked at me. She looked for the count of perhaps 4 of the chapel clock's slow seconds at the small soft swell at my waist under the deep cream wool dress. Then she laid her right hand, very gently, flat over the swell. She said one sentence in Cree to me through Father Joubert's translation. The sentence was, "The child is welcome in this family." I have not, in the 38 years since, had a sentence said to me that I have valued more. I have not, in the 38 years since, gone 3 months without remembering Pisim's hand on the wool of the dress and the small, soft, brief light of late October pine light through the east window of the chapel, and the smell of beeswax and the small carved birch crucifix on the altar. Pisim died in the spring of 1893 at the age of 83, of a cold she had picked up walking down to Diamond City in March in the same beaded shawl. She is buried in the small graveyard behind the mission, 3 stones to the south of Cassander's mother. Under a small flat fieldstone, Cassander cut himself with a chisel his grandfather had given him in 1876. Her name on the stone is in Cree syllabics and in French. The sweetgrass she laid at the altar of our wedding I kept. It is in the small flat tin box on the top shelf of the cellar pit at the cabin with the other things that matter. Cassander and I rode back up to the cabin that afternoon in the wagon, in the slow, warm light of the 3rd of November. He had filed the deed at the Lewis and Clark County Recorder's office in Helena on the previous Monday, exactly as he had told me at the work table, and he had filed it in both names, and he had filed it under the joint tenancy with right of survivorship that Father Joubert had told us, the Friday before, was the proper instrument for what we were doing. He had also filed at the recorder's office on the same Monday a small additional instrument I did not learn about until 2 months later, which was the formal adoption of the unborn child by the husband-elect in advance of the marriage, under the small territorial provision that allowed it for the children of women joining frontier homesteaders by promised marriage. That document had been filed on his quiet instruction before the wedding, so that the child's legal patrimony, in the event anything happened to either of us between the filing and the wedding, would be his. I learned about that document on the 2nd of January, when he laid it on the work table and explained it without any embellishment. I have, in the 38 years since, kept that document in the small flat tin box on the top shelf of the cellar, where Cassander and I kept the things that matter. Esther Marie Beaudry was born at the cabin at 4:15 on the morning of February the 11th, 1890, in the curtained sleeping nook against the north wall, on the rope and frame bed with the wool blanket folded at the foot, with the snow 9 feet on the upper bench and the temperature outside the cabin at 31 below. By the small thermometer Cassander had hung on the porch post in November, and a single tallow candle burning in a flat tin candlestick on the small hand-hewn pine bedside table beside the bed, and a low fire of split pine in the hearth across the room glowing soft amber. Father Joubert and Pisim had both come up the 4 miles from Diamond City the previous afternoon, Pisim on the back of Cassander's roan pack horse, and Father Joubert on his own gray mule, when Cassander had ridden down at dawn after my waters had broken at 3 in the morning. Peace, who had delivered in her 66 years on the Big Belt, by her own steady accounting, more than 200 children of the upper country, set out on the kitchen table when she came in the door, a clean square of unbleached muslin, a small leather pouch of a soft-dried herb she did not name in any language I knew, a tin cup, and a small carved wooden bowl. She heated water on the stove. She made me drink twice across the long afternoon and evening, a small, careful tin cup of an herb tea the color of weak straw that did not, by my own later asking, contain anything Father Joubert was prepared to identify in writing on a parish form. She rubbed my lower back with goose fat warmed at the hearth. She sang in Cree, a slow, careful song her grandmother had sung to her grandmother through 3 deliveries in 1858 in the upper Saskatchewan country. Father Joubert stood at the open door of the cabin with the lantern lit and the pole barn animals lowing behind him in the cold. In the careful, patient way a Métis French Catholic priest stands at the threshold of a delivery he is not, by the practice of 60 years on the frontier, going to enter unless asked. He was not asked. The labor was not easy. It was not, Peace said afterward, in her slow, careful Cree, through Father Joubert's translation across the hearth at 6 in the morning, very hard. Esther weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces by the small brass kitchen scale Cassander had taken down from the cupboard and balanced with a 5-pound iron weight from the smokehouse. Esther had her father's dark amber eyes from the first afternoon and the small chestnut curl at the temple that had been my mother's. Peace laid Esther in my arms at the 8th minute. Peace said one further sentence in Cree, again through Father Joubert's translation. The sentence was, "The child has come to the family has built for her." Cassander, who had been sitting on the small wooden chair at the foot of the curtained nook for the last hour, holding my left hand without speaking, did not say anything for the count of perhaps 4 of the bedside clock's slow seconds. Then he said, in his own slow, careful voice, "Peace, thank you, grandmother." Peace laid her hand on his head, the way a Cree grandmother lays her hand on the head of the grandson she has just delivered the daughter of, and she said, very quietly, in English, "Cassander, the cabin is big enough for 3. It is big enough now for 4. Father Joubert baptized Esther in the tin baptismal font on the kitchen table at noon of the same day, with snow-melt water that Cassander had warmed on the hearth in a clean iron skillet, and with Doss Pendergrass and Avalon Pomeroy as the godparents, Cassander and I had agreed on the previous September. Esther is now 38 years old. She is the head school teacher at the Consolidated Public School in White Sulphur Springs. She has been the head school teacher there for 14 years, since the spring of 1913, when at the age of 23 she had returned from the Montana Normal School at Dillon with a teaching certificate in the same envelope in which she carried the small folded letter from her father, offering to drive her back to Dillon for the autumn quarter on the day of her wedding, if she changed her mind. She did not change her mind. She married in the small log Lutheran chapel at White Sulphur Springs on the 30th of August, 1912, a young Lutheran pastor named Holcomb Yates Tannehill of Minnesota extraction, who had come west to St. Sulphur on a Synod Circuit assignment in 1911 and had stayed, and who had asked Cassander for permission to ask Esther in the kitchen of the cabin on a Saturday afternoon in May of 1912, with both of his careful, steady hands flat on the same hand-hewn Ponderosa work table Cassander had laid out the 3 offers on 23 years before, and who had received Cassander's permission by Cassander's own later quiet account to me in 3 sentences and a handshake. The two of them have given Cassander and me 4 grandchildren. Esme, 12, the eldest, who has Esther's chestnut curl at the temple and Holcomb's careful, slow Lutheran patience. Pip, 10, the only boy of the 4, who has the small hand axe Cassander gave him for his 8th birthday, and a notebook of bird drawings he has kept since he was 6. Lavinia, the 2nd, 7, named for me in a way I had not asked for and was not in any position to refuse. And Wren, 4, who is, at this hour, asleep in the loft above me as I write. The 4 of them come up to the cabin every summer for the 2nd week of August and stay through the 1st week of September. They sleep, the 3 girls in the loft, and Pip on the horsehair settee in the front room, in the same way Esther and Cassander and I had slept in the cabin of the 8-week build in the autumn of 1889. They wake at dawn. They go down to the spring with Cassander before breakfast. They walk the upper boundary with me after lunch. They sit at the work table each evening for supper, and the 4 of them, with Esther and Holcomb and Cassander and me, make 8 at the work table. The work table, dear listener, has not, in the 38 years since the morning of the 3rd offer, ever been pressed for the 8th chair. I will tell you, briefly, about Hosea Malden, because the story does not properly close without it. Hosea Malden married Cordelia Vermeulen Hartshorn at the Hartshorn Vermeulen House in Helena on the 7th of December, 1889. The marriage was, by the account of the Helena Independent, the social event of the season. Hosea Malden lost 48% of his cattle in the big snow winter of 1893, took out a second mortgage on the quarter section in November of that year, lost a further 19% in the 1896 storm, and was foreclosed on by the First National Bank of Helena in the spring of 1898. Cordelia Vermeulen Hartshorn divorced him on an Idaho residency in 1901. He died alone of pneumonia in a boarding house in Butte in 1906 at the age of 52. Cassander, who learned of his passing through Father Joubert, who learned of it through the Helena Diocesan newsletter, told me about it sitting at the work table on a clear, cold November evening in 1906, in 3 sentences. He laid the newsletter down. He said, "Hosea Malden is dead." He said, "I am sorry to be the one who tells you, Lavinia." He said, "Will you come outside and walk with me up to the spring before supper?" I said I would. We walked up to the spring. The spring was running clean. The pines moved high above the bench in the slow, deep way they have always moved. He did not raise the matter again. He did not, in the 19 years he had still left to him then, raise it once. Cassander Beaudry died at this cabin at 6:20 on the morning of April the 3rd, 1925, of a heart attack at the work table in the kitchen, a tin coffee cup in his right hand and a small pencil in his left, and a small blue notebook open on the table in front of him, in which he had been making a list of the 4 cedar fence posts he was going to need to replace on the upper boundary line that spring. He was 68 years old. He was buried at St. Mary's Mission in Diamond City, beside his mother, under a small, flat fieldstone Esther's husband Holcomb and our grandson Pip cut for him in his own pencil hand from a sketch he had drawn the previous October. His name on the stone is in 3 languages. I am 65 years old. I am writing this account at the work table Cassander made of cured ponderosa in the autumn of 1888. The cabin is bigger now than it was on the night of the 26th of October in 1889. Cassander added the kitchen wing in 1893, and the loft for Esther in 1896, and the loft the autumn of 1912 when Esther married Holcomb and moved down to White Sulphur Springs, has been, since, a guest room for our grandchildren, and is, at the moment, full of Esme's drawings and Pip's small wooden toy locomotive and a faded blue ribbon that was Wren's at the County 4-H Fair in 1924. The pole barn still stands. The bay gelding Caleb died in 1911 at the age of 26, peacefully in the upper pasture above the bench. The roan pack horse outlived him by 2 years. Ava, the milk cow's granddaughter, is in the pole barn this evening as I write. The spring runs clean. The high pines still move in the slow, deep way. The iron triangle on the porch post still hangs. If you are sitting on a trunk in the sleet at a four-corner crossroads, with a folded letter in your hand and $41.42 in a small leather traveling purse, I will say only this. The man on the road in the long fringed elk hide coat with the small old white scar on the left cheekbone is, in this country, the man you do not yet know to expect. He will come down the road at a slow, careful walk. He will draw up 6 paces from the trunk. He will take off his hat. He will ask you your name. He will tell you his. He will ask you the 2 questions you needed to be asked. He will answer the 2 questions you needed to ask. He will lift your trunk onto the back of the pack horse in the cottonwood screen. He will boost you into the saddle of the bay gelding with the right hand under your left elbow and the left hand at the small of your back. He will walk you the 12 miles in the sleet to a warm cabin with the lantern in his right hand. He will sleep that night in the pole barn. He will sit across the work table from you in the morning, and he will lay out 3 offers. He will say, of the 3rd offer, the cabin's big enough for 3. He will mean it. The cabin will be. The afternoon at the Crossroads will turn into a marriage at a small Catholic mission on the 3rd of November. The marriage will turn into a daughter and 4 grandchildren and a work table and a spring and a pole barn and a cabin built bigger in pieces over 38 years. The iron triangle on the porch post will not be rung at 3 in the morning. The bar on the inside of the door will not need to be dropped. The wind will move high in the pines in the slow, deep way. And the door, the cabin door, with the hand-forged iron strap hinges Cassander made on the cabin's 1st January in 1887, will open.